Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name's Josh Hodges. I'm hosting Online with an Architect. Very pleased to have a fellow Australian with me, Rene van der Bedem. Nice to have
Thanks
you on
for
board.
having me on.
Great. So, for those of you who don't know Rene, can you just give us a quick
certainly.
intro?
So I was previously at AWS. I now work at Microsoft as a principal technical program manager in the engineering group for the Azure VMware Solution. And because I'm talking to a fellow VCDX, I'm a VCDX as well in all four tracks, and also an Nutanix platform expert, similar to Josh.
Yeah, fantastic. So the only 4 times VCDX on the planet.
At the moment.
Pretty awesome.
To be honest, I was expecting... It was 2018 that I got it. I was expecting one of the other 6 triple VCDXs that are out there now, to have gone and got their fourth as well. But 5 years later, still hasn't happened. So who knows?
Yeah, wow. Well, it's very impressive. Having done 2 myself, I know the effort involved to go through and do 4 is pretty amazing. So,
a lot of work, isn't it?
And because I know you well, I know you're the type of guy to do that. So that's why you're in the position you are. So fantastic. So I've spoken to a few other VCDXs, not surprisingly, with a podcast of this title. Can you just give us a bit of a rundown on what you think the VCDX program meant to you and the value?
Yeah. Well, for me, it was certainly a journey. Because when I went into VCDX the first time, to me, it was just a challenge because I'd been through the VMware training. And just to set the example for my team, I was working as a customer then in the financial sector in Saudi Arabia. And I just said, okay, let me get a VCP, let me get the VCAPs. And part of the training, they had VCDX as the pinnacle. So I thought, I'll just go for it and let me see how I go. Obviously, the first time I failed. But yeah, I didn't really understand what it was about. So it was a very interesting journey. And when I look at it in hindsight, it was a way to pressure test and find my weaknesses as an architect, including my soft skills. And then all that feedback, I just looped back into my development process, and a year later, I passed the second time in 2014. So to me, it was really a process that I've leveraged from now on, just continuous development. And as long as I'm feeling uncomfortable with what I'm doing, I know that I'm on the right path. So it's like a feedback function for me. That's how I've been using it.
Yeah, fantastic. Similar to my experience as well, and similar to a lot of other VCDXs. They weren't sure what the program was. They attempted. They might not have been successful 1 or even 2 times, but then they got through eventually. So I think that's a common trait of VCDXs, is that resilience, and just keep pushing forward with that continuous learning. So yeah, fantastic. And just a quick brief on your NPX as well. For those of you who don't know, it's Nutanix's platform expert, which is similar to a VCDX, but Rene, if you can tell us what you think.
Yeah, so it was certainly an evolution. I remember when I went for NPX. So the true triggers for me about the Nutanix ecosystem was, I think when you moved to Nutanix, Josh, that was one thing when I went, oh, Josh is going there. Maybe there's something behind Nutanix. So I started looking into it. And then Mark Brunstad moved across to kickstart the NPX program. And I went, oh, okay, there's something here. So I kept my ear to the ground as the NPX program was being developed. And when it was, I think it was when it was in beta. So you guys were going through your defenses in Miami at the first .NEXT conference. That was when I committed. I thought, okay, let me go for this. I think hyperconverged infrastructure is the next generation. Obviously, Nutanix is the leader in that space. And then when I look at my experiences going through NPX, I think the rigor was a higher level than VCDX. To me, it felt like it was maybe one level more of difficulty because there were 2 hypervisors that you needed to master, because obviously Nutanix runs with vSphere KVM, so the Nutanix variant of KVM, which obviously now is called AHV, and Hyper-V. Sorry.
It's dumped you there on the hypervisor.
It's been a while since I've touched AHV. So yeah, that was certainly a period of growth as well. Obviously, a new technology stack. There was a new hypervisor in there, and then also the level of documentation. I remember. So Michael Webster, he was my Nutanix NPX buddy, because you get paired, as you know. And he did the first check of my documentation, and he had quite a bit of feedback. And when I was going through VCDX, I was using the same level of documentation that I had for VCDX. So it was interesting that I had to go a little further, to describe my solution and capture that correctly. So that was certainly an evolution as well.
Oh, Michael Webster, fantastic. A friend of mine, obviously brilliant guy, and any feedback from him is always
Absolutely
welcome. So I'm sure it was very constructive. And look, designing the NPX program, it certainly wasn't a secret. We wanted to use VCDX as an inspiration and try and go that next level up. So, it's not surprising to hear you say that. And that was the goal. Obviously, one of the requirements for NPX was you had to submit a design on Hypervisor 1 and do a design scenario on an alternative hypervisor of your choice. So the idea behind that was it was straight away a multi-vendor solution. So it wasn't just one technology group, it was multiple. And you had to therefore be able to know alternatives of at least one other hypervisor and how to design and implement at an expert level. So that certainly made things a lot harder. That's for sure.
Yeah, it did. And AHV had just been released back then. Well, Nutanix was still calling it KVM. And I remember I'd never worked with KVM before. There was, I think, a good 2 months of just learning KVM and how to troubleshoot it, how to design for it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was certainly a very interesting experience.
Yeah, the one thing I found, I remember, was because AHV was quite new, it had a lot of limitations at the time. So when you try to translate a design from vSphere, which is very mature, even in 2015, very mature product, into AHV, it was like, we don't have this capability, or it doesn't work like that, or how do we go about that? And it's not just a matter of, people thought, you can just switch over hypervisors quite easily.
No.
But depending on the complexity of the design, it's actually a redesign. So it's not a trivial task to be able to.
Well, and particularly back then, before KVM became AHV and was much more tightly integrated operationally into Prism Element, to me, the day two operations required a lot more careful consideration. And then also you've got your security use cases and some of your compute virtualization use cases where, you're expecting these advanced vSphere features, which obviously didn't exist back then. They do now. It was certainly very interesting. A big learning curve.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I found the most satisfying about my journey as well, was it was just a huge learning curve. I'd done the VCDX, a couple of VCDXs, and then I was like, cool, next challenge, NPX, and just keep that learning going. So, as far as the methodology and the critical thinking and all this, that kind of translated well. But applying it to a completely different technology, it was good fun. Yeah. So, I'm glad we both went through that.
I remember the day of the defense. So I was the first one to defend when the program was generally available. And then I think Richard Assinian, he was after me. And I remember going into the Nutanix HQ early morning, and every NPX that had already been certified was sitting there, as well as Mark Brunstad. So it was very much a feeling of being in front of a firing squad.
I remember it well. I can't talk about it. I was your panelist, but that's an NDA. But I remember it very well with fond memories, so I can say that. And the lunch afterwards, I think was the best.
Cool.
Yeah, that I guess we can share is that we took lunch. So myself and about 6, maybe 5 other NPXs and Mark Brunstad took Rene out for lunch. Maybe 2 hours after his defense, and that's when we announced to him that he'd actually passed. And the look on his face was hilarious
because I wasn't
it
sure
was almost
if I passed or not. Because everyone has got a poker
so fun.
face. You've got no idea where you stand. You've got to guess, and you're replaying your conversations in your head. Oh, I got that slightly wrong. Oh, that wasn't quite right. Yeah, so that was a great memory.
Yeah, you're definitely a brave man, being the first external applicant, that's for sure. But nothing surprises me with you, so good on you. So let's talk a bit more about what you're doing day to day. So Azure VMware Solution, pretty cool focus. One thing for me, especially from my company's perspective, is a lot of customers are very interested in these hyperscaler and hypervisor solutions. So AVS being obviously one of them. So let's just talk a little bit about what that is for those who don't know, and then we'll dive a bit deeper.
So if you look at the VMware integrations, so software-defined data center as a service is probably the easiest way to capture it in one word, SDDC as a service. There's 4 major use cases that a customer can address. Number 1 is disaster recovery as a service, just a quick and easy way to have a second site running in a cloud, whatever hyperscaler that may be, and use a disaster recovery technology like VCDR, SRM, Zerto, and Jetstream, depending upon the hyperscaler that you're dealing with. Quick and easy way to do that. Second use case is the data center exit. So you are done with managing on-prem data centers, your on-prem vSphere infrastructure, and you just want to consume it as a service. So data center exit is the second one. The third is data center extension. So you want to have access to additional resources on a shorter term basis. Typically, like Black Friday for retail, that kind of thing. And you're happy to run in a hybrid cloud model. So that's number 3. And then number 4, which is also very popular, is application modernization. So that running monolithic legacy business critical applications is something that you don't want to do forever. You want to modernize at some point to a hyperscaler platform as a service model. And then what you're doing is you're using the VMware infrastructure in the hyperscaler as a staging area. So you migrate there and you've got like a 1 year, a 2 year, or a 3 year plan where over time what's going to happen is your vSphere workloads, monolithic workloads running in the cloud are going to shrink over time as you modernize to the native hyperscaler applications. So they're the 4 major use cases where we're getting value.
Yeah, I can tell you've done that pitch before.
Many.
So it's very, very good. Yeah, so for me, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, and definitely as an architect you know this, is on-prem is still very complicated to architect. It's not just a cookie cutter reference architecture, bang, and you've got a solution. If you architect your environment on-prem correctly, it's still an expensive and time-consuming exercise. One of the values that I see is with these solutions is a lot of that work is done for you. The implementation is largely done, and you are just adding on top of something. It might be, say, 80% done, and then you customize the 20%. So you can focus more where it's valuable rather than just on the nuts and the bolts and the physical hardware layer. So I feel like that's far more efficient in terms of time to value for sure, but also it reduces the complexity that the architect has to go through because there's a smaller scope to actually address. What are your thoughts on that?
That is true. One of the downsides of moving to VMware in a hyperscaler, and it depends which hyperscaler you go with, but typically what it means is networking is one of the big poles in the tent that you need to address because you're now using a cloud networking technology of some type, and they are all slightly different across the hyperscalers. And number two is the security posture, because you're running in a multi-tenant environment. And if you've got very strict governance and compliance rules, that is something that needs to be addressed and considered in your design. And number three, that most vSphere administrators are not the biggest fan of running VMware in VMware vSphere in a hyperscaler environment, is that the solution boundary becomes so much more narrow because it's a managed service in most cases. So that is probably one of the biggest things that they need to get their heads around. Also, day two operations can be a bit of a struggle for a company or a customer that is ITIL compliant, and they're used to having, all of the traditional ITIL workflows running. Because obviously a managed service, things are going on under the covers. So very commonly the questions are about logging, change management. How are they going to know what's going on underneath in the back end? And it's this switch from the pet mentality to the cattle mentality. That's probably one of the hardest switches when you look at it from people, process, technology, and financials. It's the process part along with the people, because obviously they have to upskill as well with whatever cloud environment they're running in.
Yeah, I think that people part is always key, because we get used to doing things a certain way. We get comfortable, and a lot of people don't like change. And sometimes that can be challenging. So I think one of the objections is absolutely just the people aspect. We want to control it. I think the old saying, which sounds a little derogatory, but it's the server hugger. So the person who just wants to hug that hardware and keep a hold of it nice and tight. I think those are the type of people who might struggle with that migration. And yeah, like you say, ITIL is a big piece for a lot of customers. So there's a lot of potential places where a customer might say, "Nah, I'll use that. That's the roadblock. I won't proceed further." But I think if they look at the roadblock as opposed to the value, they're going to miss out significantly on. 4 examples you gave were perfect. The data center, extension is a perfect example where customers need to size on-prem for their burst capacity, whereas with data center extension, they can size for what they need and then expand. So I think there's so much value there that customers really should be looking at it. And one thing I also like is the ability to change between the providers. So although it's not as simple as maybe the marketing slides make it out, it's definitely not. I'm sure it will be a lot easier in the future, but I think just that ability to choose and have a roughly standardized offering across multiple hyperscalers is fantastic. Because if it's a commercial reason you need to move from one to another, great. If it's a legal reason, or if it's a compliance reason, that's good as well. Or if it's simply just due to a differentiated offering, it gives you that flexibility. Whereas on-prem, we are really quite stuck. Once we've invested in that hardware and infrastructure, it might be 3 years, it might be 5 years, but we are quite restricted in a lot of cases.
Certainly. Just touching on the people component. So what's interesting is that when you look at the project champions for running VMware vSphere in the cloud, typically the champions are at the leadership level. So it'll be the CIO, the CTO, sometimes the CFO, because they see the financial benefit, and they also understand the faster time to market and the ability to expand dynamically and run in whatever region the hyperscaler supports around the world. That is something that is, they see the business value of that. It's when you go further down the totem pole from a technology perspective, so the people perspective of who own the technology, the lower you get, that's where you get the more resistance, because certainly your vSphere administrator does love having root access to their infrastructure. And that's probably one of their biggest complaints when they're moving to a hyperscale, because you no longer have root access, at least for Azure VMware Solution and VMware Cloud on AWS. Some of the other hyperscalers, they give you root access and you can basically build what you want. and integrate what you want. Obviously, with those solution boundaries being a lot more flexible, it means there's a little more risk with the managed service because you end up with these snowflakes. But certainly for Azure VMware Solution, we're trying to keep the solution boundaries quite narrow because we want to deliver a consistent service to everyone.
Yeah, actually, that word you've just hit on, consistent, is something I've heard from a lot of VCDXs about their architecture after they've certified, and also what they're trying to deliver customers is consistency. So I think for anyone out there who's a vSphere admin who loves having all the access to everything, that's great. I'm glad you've had that experience. But think about elevating where you are in an organization and the value you provide, and just think about the business outcome you're delivering. Your access to root or your access to the hardware is not delivering a business outcome, right? That's just a function you're performing as part of your role. So if you can elevate yourself, think more at an architectural level, and start your VCDX journey, you'll probably be in a much more rewarding position. Like Rene at Microsoft is a great example, and probably get paid better, be able to do a broader role as well. So, I mean, there's plenty of people who love being vSphere admins and will do that very happily forever. But there's a lot of people I would say just challenge yourself. You can be a vSphere admin as well as doing architecture work.
Yeah.
So it's very rewarding.
And when you talk about it from a business value perspective, it's flipping the paradigm of an administrator spending 70% of their time keeping the lights on. You want to flip that around. You want to spend 10% of your time keeping the lights on and 90% of your time delivering value for the company, with projects that actually grow the service that you're delivering to your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And that modernization of apps piece that you mentioned earlier, if we're focusing most of our time on keeping the lights on, we don't have enough time and attention to focus on that critical project, which to me is probably one of the main reasons those projects take a long time or fail ultimately, is just because they don't get enough attention.
Yeah.
So
and typically when you have a company that is spending a lot of the time keeping the lights on, they tend to outsource the modernization efforts to system integrators. And you'll be very aware, Josh, that not all system integrators are created equally, which is certainly one of the motivators I know for you creating your company, that end-to-end ownership to deliver business value to your customers. So if you're spending less time keeping the lights on, then you can certainly take care of these modernization efforts yourself and certainly reduce risk to your business.
Yeah, exactly right. I think the value of keeping the lights on is obviously there, but the innovation piece is much higher value. So as long as we are consistent keeping the lights on, how that's delivered, if it goes into AVS, fantastic. You do have more time. So certainly that's what I recommend to my customers is focus on the higher value piece, right? If we can move to a hyperscaler and take away some of that burden on the team, great. It's not about getting rid of the team either. This is actually the other thing that a lot of people get worried about. If we move to something like AVS, where's my job? Well, your job evolves. So, and Rene and I have talked about this over the years, whether it was when I was at IBM, whether I was at Nutanix, and even now, I'm trying to make functions of my job redundant as often as possible, and trying to elevate to the next level just constantly. So if you can take away that vSphere admin piece, or at least the bulk of it, and focus on the app modernization, your job has evolved. You're not getting replaced. If we stay stagnant in a role as just an admin forever, at some point you may well be replaced because you're becoming more and more of a commodity the less you innovate your skill set.
Yeah, and I know for me personally, if I start feeling complacent or I feel that the job that I'm in, I've mastered it and, there's nothing new, that to me is now, it's a signal in the back of my brain. Okay, you need to start getting busy. You need to start evolving. You need to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key. Comfortable being uncomfortable. It's something we say in jiu-jitsu as well. So when someone's pushing your head into the mat and your face is all screwed up and you're uncomfortable, just breathe, be calm, and continue on and think about what you're doing. The same is true in the career. So absolutely. So the other thing I was going to say with AVS, because big fan of these solutions, is from a DR perspective. What are you seeing customers do, and what are you seeing from a success perspective, and also what would you guide people away from doing due to it not working for whatever reason?
So architecturally, I'm always wary of customers that have got a multi-spoke or a multi-mesh DR infrastructure. I've been burned by that in the past when I was working in the partner space when I first moved here to the US. So this was a very large bank, and they just had disaster recovery replications going all over the place. And it meant that when there was a disaster, there was so much operational complexity. No one knew what was going where. And it was unusable. So the customers that are successful with disaster recovery is they keep it simple. They have well-defined SLAs that they understand. So typically gold, silver, bronze. Bronze will probably not have disaster recovery and maybe just backup replication. And then silver and gold will have different SLAs, and they set the policies correctly so that they're actually meeting the RPO and RTO that have been defined. So this allows you to tier the design and either go with a dedicated cluster per SLA or a dedicated SDDC per SLA strategy. And having this multi-pod, multi-cluster architecture, it makes it much more easy to understand and plan and execute. And I'm sure you're aware, Josh, that when you build a disaster recovery solution, obviously building it, setting up the replication and the policies and getting data consistency replication between the primary site and the disaster recovery site, that's obviously the easiest part. It's when you go into a recovery scenario to test it and test it regularly, that's typically where customers will trip up and maybe not do it correctly, because I think doing regular testing of disaster, so the business continuity side so that people know what they have to do, that really is the key to success. The technology part is fairly easy.
Yeah, I think the process and even the declaration of a disaster is something I always find hilarious, especially when I do boot camps and I teach people enterprise architecture. It's, okay, something's happened. Who's telling us to fail over, right? Because very unlikely you're going to fully automate that. So and someone has to say...
It should never be, because the last thing you want is a DR automation system to accidentally declare a disaster. And that's why it should be the CIO or the CTO or the CEO, depending upon the size of the company, that makes the declaration. And then everyone executes the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think understanding what's the criteria, what level of failure at your primary data center justifies a failover. Because obviously there's an implication when you fail over. At some stage, you've got to fail back. You've got to re-replicate the data. There are issues with that as well. It's not just a one button and it's done, as much as the marketing slides would like you to believe. So to me, that's the piece that a VCDX really helps with, is defining under what scenario does it make sense to fail over, and under what scenario does it make sense to actually just resolve the issue where it is. If it's a service degradation and you're still servicing your workload to a minimally viable level, then let's leave it where it is and let's try and resolve that. And then in the event we can't resolve that, then we can do more of a controlled failover. So I think that piece is more of a people and a process than it is a technology piece. And that's, something obviously a really good architect can guide customers on.
Yeah, I would agree. And the same goes for when a disaster is declared. How do you declare the disaster over, and how long should you wait at the DR site before you start replicating back and bringing things back online at the primary sites? That's also a very subtle area that gets overlooked. People don't think about it.
Yeah, very important though. Absolutely. It's all the little 1%ers, I like to call them, that make the big difference. A lot of people, their architecture will be like 80, 90% right. and well-defined. But it's those just little pieces during a DR situation which really show up and can cause significant delays. So obviously, if you've got a recovery time objective of an hour and you get sidetracked for 20 minutes because you forgot to document a process or you don't know how to declare a failure, then your RTO is going to get missed, and that can be a huge cost to a business. And speaking of cost, I've had a lot of people talk to me, even when I was at Nutanix, focusing on their NC2 solution, talking about it appears to be very expensive to be using a hypervisor in a hyperscaler, regardless of the vendor. And to me, every time I did a TCO and an ROI with guys like Steve Kaplan, who I know you know, what I actually found was if we architected the solution well from a sizing perspective, we made some reasonable assumptions around overcommitment and things like this, that the solutions were actually quite cost competitive while delivering what I felt was a lot more value because it's largely managed. And the mistakes I think I saw people doing was trying to pick up what they've got on-prem and just make it exactly the same in an AVS solution. Whereas to me, it's AVS is different to your on-prem, more than likely. It's very unlikely you've got the exact same size hosts, for example. And even if you did, is your sizing on-prem actually, is it done well? Are things performing well? Have you consolidated where you should? Have you overcommitted to an appropriate level? All these kind of factors. So when I went through these exercises, what I actually found was customers who were trying to modernize, they were planning for like 5 years, but they had constraints, which meant they wanted to get out of their data centers a lot sooner. But they felt cost was a major factor. But when we actually went through the sizing exercise, it actually showed that, well, actually it's pretty cost effective to go there now. And then to your earlier point about app modernization, it just means AVS is going to host 90% of your workload today, and then over time it'll shrink down as apps are modernized, assuming you don't want to keep them on the same platform. But yeah, what are your experiences with cost? Yeah. I know obviously working at Microsoft, it might be a sensitive topic, but to me, I think the value is very well justified for the amount you pay.
Certainly. Yeah, I would agree. So when I look at customers that are used to the CapEx model, they are the ones who struggle with converting to OpEx and TCO, the TCO way of thinking. They don't consider OpEx, or they think of it as a CapEx over 3 or 5 years, and they don't quite understand the value that they're getting from a people, process, and technology perspective. So where I've found the customers that have been the most successful with this type of thing is they'll do the full TCO, the full ROI. They will consume or they will purchase reserved instances. A mistake a lot of CapEx customers will do is they'll just go with pay-as-you-go, which obviously is the most expensive. In addition to that, you've got the enterprise agreements that the hyperscalers have. So you're committing to a certain period of time and a certain amount of money per year in cloud spend, including the VMware technology. And that also gives you additional discounts. So the trick is to make sure all of this is built into the TCO model. And then from a people and process perspective, obviously it's a managed service, so they no longer have to worry about the care and feeding, so that needs to be accounted for as well in the TCO. That time is gone. And then also from a people perspective, you're going to be taking your skilled staff and you're going to be reusing them in other projects and other things. They're no longer going to be there as a full-time employee, 70% of the time keeping the lights on. So once all of that gets built into the TCO, it is certainly a much more cost-effective approach to running your infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something Steve Kaplan does a great job of. Steve, a former Nutanix person, as you know, and he and I built one of the tools they use for NC2, and factoring in each of these pieces really makes telling that story very easy. And when it's on a spreadsheet or it's on a presentation and you can go through those
line
different
by
sections,
line.
people go, oh, point, yeah. So it's not just, CapEx for 50 hosts versus 50 hosts. And like you say, pay as you go is more expensive. And I think that's the key as well, is working out what your minimal viable solution is and reserving those instances. And then for your burst capability, sure, pay as you go is fine for your burst because you're only using them for a short period of time. But if you're bursting for, say, 6 months of the year, which is what a lot of customers think bursting is, which is not
It's
really
not.
the intent, and you may as well reserve those instances because 6 months of pay as you go is pretty much the cost
It
of
is.
reserving
That's
anyway.
right.
So you've got to consider, if you're bursting for a month, yeah, burst or pay as you go makes sense. But if you're bursting often, then reserving, even though from a technology perspective it might seem like you're underutilized, from a commercial model perspective, which is obviously what we have to balance as architects, it makes sense to reserve. And yeah, of course, I think the staff retention is another thing where I think solutions like AVS is really going to help. Is if you've got a vSphere admin and they're getting a bit complacent, they're a bit bored, they've been doing the same thing for a long time, you might lose that staff member who's got a lot of intellectual property and is quite valuable to your organization. But if you were to do something like move to AVS, straight away, that's a really interesting project for sure. I love doing these projects. And then that person's skill set is increasing. You've given them a bigger challenge. They might move into a junior or type architect role, and you might retain that staff as well. So I think there's a lot of indirect benefits, or arguably that could be a direct benefit of going to these solutions, is keeping your staff well engaged and motivated by giving them really good projects to work on.
Yeah, one of the common things I see is when a customer is running on-prem, they have the vSphere team, the team of administrators and operators and architects. And when they've made that commitment to go with one hyperscaler, those people tend to move to the cloud team, and then they start cross-pollinating the skills so that they start to learn the native hyperscaler technology as well. And they do the transfer of that knowledge for vSphere to the cloud people in that team, if they're there. Sometimes it's all brand new. So it's
Absolutely.
a big upskilling event.
Yeah, which to me is really quite valuable. Obviously, both of us have embarked on these journeys for these certifications over the years and kept them up to date and multi-vendor solutions and things like that. I think if we can get and encourage people to do these programs and broaden their horizons, they're going to enjoy their jobs a lot more. Certainly for me, I like challenging myself on a regular basis. I was doing the Tanzu stuff recently, and I hadn't done a lot with Tanzu, so getting up to speed on that and learning a new area, it was fantastic. So, even at the VCDX level, there's plenty to learn.
Yeah,
so
and I would say that VCDX is just that first step is, okay, you now understand how much you don't know, and you just got to keep on rinsing and repeating.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. All VCDX taught me was that there's so much more to know. And, from if I think about what I did 10 years ago, or 12 or whenever I got my VCDX to now, I think I'd be horrified at the quality that I delivered 10 years ago. But because every year I'm evolving that and I'm trying to level it up and I'm talking with people like yourself and learning from colleagues and friends and even other vendors and things like that. So yeah, that's also why I love working with VCDX and NPX level people. At Nutanix, I was actually at IBM. There was 2 VCDXs. At Nutanix, obviously there was a ton, and now I've got a team of 4 at end to end. So, very privileged from my perspective to have that level of talent to help me grow my career as well.
Yeah, working with people who are more accomplished. The last thing you want to be is a big fish in a small pond. You always want to be the minnow in the big pond because that way you just keep on growing, and you keep on raising the bar. Everyone's raising the bar. There's no other way.
100%. And obviously, you and I haven't done a whole bunch of work together in the past, but we've had lots of conversations like this, and every time I learn something. So, yeah,
And
I
vice
think one of the
versa.
drivers behind this podcast is sharing that knowledge with the broader community. So, the virtualization and hyperscaler communities are massive. There's a lot of talented people. And I think people will be surprised. There's a lot of people that are not very well known, but very talented people who might start, podcasting or, getting on blogs and social media and stuff. And I'd encourage all those people to do that.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, Josh. Like in engineering at Microsoft, there is so much talent there, and they're all introverts. So you'll never hear from them on social media or whatever. And it's just amazing the people that you'll be talking to, and you go, "Ooh, I didn't know that." And just a 10 or a 20-minute conversation, you've learned 2 or 3 new things. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I tried to do at Nutanix, actually, we had a lot of engineers, very brilliant as well, who, again, weren't social media people, maybe a bit introverted. I tried to work with them and, obviously learn for myself and for the customers, but also put some of that stuff out in the blogs. So, yeah, for sure. If everyone thinks the blogs I put out was all me, they're sorely mistaken. There was a lot of talented people contributing to those, and I hope I gave credit in some of those articles where it was due. But, yeah, I think, guys like us, we are like sponges. We seek out and we try and absorb that information. And, yeah, it's about finding those people in an organization and learning from them. So tell me, AVS, where do you see it in 12 months and say in 3 years? From a functional perspective, what do you think might be new without breaking any, obviously, confidentiality? And then where do you see that whole hyperscaler and hypervisor market going?
Yeah, so Azure VMware Solution, the first incarnation 1.0, that went live in September of 2020, and that was the Cloud Simple product. And Cloud Simple, I'm sure you're aware, that was bought by Google a few months later after that go live date, and that is now being deprecated. So now we have AVS 2.0, which is the current generation of the platform. That is now, I think, reached feature maturity. It's something that I'm comfortable for a strategic customer to run with. Okay, so all of the teething problems that you get with a new service, they've now been resolved. And we're now looking at the next generation, which is 3.0. And 3.0 is really all about moving to Azure native bare metal and Azure native services. Because at the moment it's running on proprietary infrastructure in pods in 27 or 29 regions around the world. And to get the greater scale, we need to be running on Azure native bare metal hardware. So that's the next generation. We're also
fantastic.
Sorry, close that out.
I would say that's probably going to. Oh, sorry, my bad. Go
on. And we're also working in the back end to continue maintaining a very, very high level of operational consistency. We want automation in the back end as we scale and bring on more customers. We want automated resolution of all of the common problems that come up. So there's something that we have running, but there's always room for improvement when it comes to operational consistency, operational reliability, and a consistent experience for our customers.
I'm sure all the service managers and CIOs out there listening will be very happy to hear that. I think getting a consistent outcome that's mostly automated, removing human error is very attractive. So that sounds like a really good enhancement for version 3. And what I interrupted you rudely to say, before, was I feel like that's going to drive a lot of cost efficiency as well, because it sounds like at the moment AVS is a bit of a proprietary bespoke solution within Azure, whereas it's going to become part of the broader offering and more scalable and easy to manage and things like that. So I think that's a great innovation from Microsoft, and I'm sure customers will benefit from that in the not too distant future. So I have another question, one quite close to my heart, actually. When is AVS going to support the Express storage architecture?
So at the moment, we're running vSphere 7.3 update. So update 3K. I think we're planning on update 3M at the moment. We have an engineering effort running at the moment in this semester to move to vSphere 8. And that also includes leveraging our Azure native bare metal infrastructure. So that's something that's going on at the moment. And that's one of the decision points. Do we stick with OSA, so the vSAN original storage architecture, and then move to the ESA, which is the new Express storage architecture, which is what I would say is very Nutanix-esque in architecture design when I look at it from a high level. So hopefully soon we'll be doing that when we do the vSphere 8 upgrades.
Yeah, fantastic. I think ESA, like you say, is a really good enhancement from an architecture perspective to the vSAN product. And yeah, very much like Nutanix. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of Nutanix, and vSAN going down that route is a brilliant move. And it'll be interesting to compare those products down the track. So speaking of Nutanix, so Nutanix has Nutanix Cloud Clusters, or NC2 it's called. What are your thoughts on NC2, and do you do much with NC2 at Microsoft?
So my team, we were supposed to be involved in Nutanix on Azure, or NC2 on Azure, but it hasn't happened yet. So I've stood it up, kicked the tires, just to play with it within Azure, getting ready for when that was going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Interestingly, NC2 on Azure also runs on the same proprietary hardware that the Azure VMware Solution does. So it's all pretty much the same. So yeah, I think it's an impressive product. It's just a matter of adoption, getting customers to be aware of it and having them adopt NC2 as part of their playbook instead of running on-prem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the same as what we talked about before, that giving customers that choice. So now not only can they go from on-prem data centers into a hyperscaler fairly quickly and easily compared to traditional refactoring, they can also then go from vendor A to vendor B or vice versa, and they can do that cloud native step as well. So I think there's a lot of choice within Azure for customers. It's basically, the best of the HCI offerings. It's bringing in that managed services piece, and then it's giving them the opportunity to, do that refactoring in an efficient manner within the same environment. And in the event that doesn't go well, they can of course fail back, and it's not a massive issue. So, yeah, I think Azure's got a pretty attractive offering.
And that's actually a good point, Josh. One of the things that did impress me when I was using NC2 on Azure was the fact that the my.nutanix.com portal was integrated into the Azure portal, and you could actually drive your infrastructure from the Nutanix portal, which is for Azure VMware Solution, right? Everything is done from the Azure portal. So I thought that operational consistency was quite cool for NC2, regardless of the hyperscaler that you're running with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was certainly the goal when I was at Nutanix, to try and make it as consistent as possible, because that's where things in my mind are heading, is that multi-cloud world where you might use multiple vendors, and the fewer tools you need to learn and upskill and maintain, I think the better. So yeah, I think Nutanix have done a good job there, and VMware are doing a great job as well, and they've obviously got a broader number of hyperscalers. Obviously got Oracle and Google and Amazon as well. Yeah. So there's quite a lot of choice there for customers, and IBM as well, and some of the more niche providers.
Yeah, I think
as well,
Alibaba has got one as well for the Asian market.
Yeah, so I mean, this thing's
It is.
exploding. It will be very interesting to see how the vendors differentiate, I think, because there are some now, like you said, with the management piece. Some are more fully managed, and some are more, they give you the keys to the castle and you can go for it. So customers also have that choice as
Yeah.
well.
An interesting point is that when you look at the hyperscaling offerings, to me, really the first question I ask a customer that's looking at Azure VMware Solution, and even when I was working for AWS, supporting VMware Cloud on AWS, it really came down to what is the preferred hyperscaler of the customer. Because if they're anti Microsoft and anti Azure, there really is no point investing in Azure for Azure VMware Solution. That was really the direction that I was taking them, because there is so much work that goes into building out your landing zones correctly so that you've got a secure multi-region infrastructure depending upon the business requirements. It's a lot of effort if you're just coming there for a VMware software-defined data center. There has to be a greater strategy and a greater play. So I feel that is really where the resonance comes in for when a customer is selecting a hyperscaler for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I've certainly heard a lot of customers say, "Oh, we'll never go into AWS, or we'll never go into Azure, or insert your favorite vendor." And I always say to customers, "Look, is there a real reason for that? Like, did you fail one of their exams and you're annoyed at them, or is there a genuine business reason not to want to go into a hyperscaler?" And from my perspective, I think the ultimate solution would be one where, whether it's on-prem or you've got multiple hyperscalers, that you can actually move between them in a fairly efficient and easy manner for both burst workloads, for DR, and for scale and all these type of things, and also for compliance, keeping data in the right regions around the world. So I would like to help customers get there at some point. Obviously, I don't think the offerings are mature enough to realistically deploy that today, but certainly start making the steps to doing that. And if you do have an outage with one hyperscaler, which of course can happen, we certainly see that sometimes, then having another hyperscaler there for another option is a great place to be, in my opinion. But to your point, having these landing zones everywhere, there is complexity there is cost. It does require pretty top quality architecture and a very high level of networking expertise to achieve it.
Yeah. No, to your point about multi-cloud, the way I think about it and the way I explain it to my customers who are going down the multi-cloud route is, think of 10 years ago when you were designing on-prem and deciding on the number of hardware vendors you were going to have in your data center for storage and compute and networking. And I always found the customers that were doing more than 2 vendors per functional area, storage, network, and compute, if they had 3 or more, it was just an absolute nightmare operationally, because you didn't have the skill set and everything didn't quite fit together. You had these not quite right architectures. There was always something going wrong. Whereas the ones that trusted one vendor for each area, or 2 vendors for each area, they tended to be more successful. And I feel the same way about multi-cloud, because to your point, they're very complicated and they're all very different as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the choice is, you might want to have multiple, but you might not want 3. Like 2 might be that sweet spot. It's sort of like 2's company, 3's a crowd, old saying. I remember back in the day, people would have their EMC and their NetApp and their IBM storage and all sorts of other options, and all connected into the same environment that have all these data stores, and capacity management was a nightmare. And, even with things like storage DRS and stuff, it's not as simple as what people make it out to be. And lots of complexity, lots of problems. Every time a new VM was created, people are like, well, I need NetApp because NetApp does this well, or I want EMC because they do this well. And it was just hilarious. So I think yeah, minimizing the scope is always a good idea. Going with just enough to achieve the outcome and get that resiliency and redundancy. So, yeah,
I
I think
think there's a lot to be said for the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid, and
Do you know?
only become more complicated if you've got a constraint that is an important constraint that is blocking you from meeting a business requirement. Then, okay, you add a little more complexity, but you should always be avoiding it like the plague.
Yeah, absolutely. What I find hilarious, and I was almost laughing there as you said that, because so many people I've spoken to on this podcast have talked about exactly that, the KISS principle, making sure that you're not overcomplicating things. And given what John Arazid and I discussed, which was VCDX was aimed at delivering a consistent quality of architecture. So getting people through a program where VMware customers would get a consistent quality from whoever the architect was, and that they weren't dependent on Josh, who did the design, or Rene, who did the design. It could be handed between the two of us, and we could both achieve the outcome. Everyone is saying a very similar thing, and it's so funny because every VCDX seems to consistently be saying similar things. Each of us have our different opinions and our different value, but we are all very alike in probably 80% of what we do. And it's all around keeping things simple and giving customers good outcomes. So every time I speak to someone about this, it's a bit of a rinse and repeat. And I might have to, talk to someone on a completely different topic soon, because there might be a little bit of redundancy cropping into our podcast. But that's good. So what's next for Rene? You've got 4 VCDXs, you've got an NPX, right? You've got this amazing role at Microsoft, right, leading Azure's VMware solution. What do you see yourself doing in the next, say, 12 months? And what's your next challenge certification-wise? Is there something in the works you want to share, or you want to keep that?
So when I was at AWS, I spent a year and a half just upskilling on AWS, going through their certification matrix. When I joined Microsoft a year and a half ago, similar thing with Azure. I was just deep diving into Azure. I know that 2 of the new design VCAPs have been released for 2023, so for cloud and for vSphere. So I'm trying to get company funding to knock those 2 out. So in the short term, those are my next steps. Just continuing to learn the Azure platform. There is so much there, so many services. And as we move to Azure VMware Solution 3.0, we obviously want to leverage more of the Azure platform natively. So I'm spending a lot of time there. In particular, artificial intelligence. Obviously, that's something that's been very popular in probably the last 6 months with ChatGPT. So I'm spending a little bit of time with that. So yeah, I'm just continuing to consolidate and improve my skills for the position that I have, because I've only been at Microsoft for a year and a half. And you know what it's like when you join a new company. You've got to learn the new culture and everything, and you want to be a good corporate citizen and deliver value. So I'm still learning my job, if I'm completely honest.
Well, I think that's a very humble view, because I've heard from people at Microsoft how brilliant you are, and I'm not at all surprised that they think that. But I think that's a great example for the listeners. Is someone at Rene's level of experience and qualification, still thinks after a year and a half they're learning how to do their job, even though Rene is probably one of the best architects in the world, quite clearly. So, yeah,
thanks.
That's very very humble man. So we've been talking for an hour. I'll try and not take up too much of your time. Have you got any other thoughts you'd like to share with us before we wrap up?
So just on the self-improvement route, so VCDX and Nutanix Platform Expert, if you're serious about the VMware or Nutanix ecosystem, I think and you're naturally curious and you're looking for your next challenge, I would certainly at least encourage you to look consider going for this. It is a long journey because obviously you need the VMware certified training to get your first VCP and then your VCAPs to VCIX and then to VCDX. So it is a long journey. But if you're interested in being the best that you can be, I certainly, it's been a rewarding experience for me personally. So if you've got the time and the inclination, it's worth a shot at least.
I couldn't agree more. I think, we've only become better architects as a result of this journey. And one thing you mentioned right at the start is when you're unsuccessful on that first attempt, you learnt so much that you came back and you were better. I talked about this with a couple of the guests in earlier episodes, and everyone said the same thing. Most people failed first time, and then they learnt so much from the experience that, to me, I think failing the process even multiple times is actually a good thing. You get to experience the pressure cooker, as you described it very, very nicely earlier, of a panel of experts giving you, expert level questioning. You're presenting, you're sharpening your soft skills. You're making sure you have a deeper understanding of all your decisions and your design set and troubleshooting and design scenarios. I think it's great. So I think the only failure is failure to try. And everyone should have a go. The VCP and the VCAP exams, the blueprints are out there. You know what you need to study. They're not that difficult, right? They show a good level of skill set, but they're far from impossible. And the other thing with VCDX and NPX that I want to stress to people is it's not testing who's the best architect in the world. It's testing who is a minimally viable candidate to perform the role of an enterprise or a solution architect. So it's not, are you as good as Rene or as good as Michael Webster? You don't have to be the best of the best of the best like those guys. You just have to be competent at the role where, in most cases, you can perform the role without assistance. All of us get help. So, I don't know everything for sure. And most VCDXs are way smarter than me. So, I'm at the minimally qualified candidate level, and then everyone else is
Josh is being
above
humble,
me. But these certifications are a great way to learn more than the certification themselves. I think if I never passed, I would still be exactly where I am today, right? The certification definitely helps open doors and things like that. But as far as my skill set, if the bar for VCDX was higher than I could achieve, I've still learnt everything. I've still challenged myself. I've still gotten a lot better. So there's value there just going through that experience. I can't recommend it enough, actually. And VMware Education and I recorded a video recently, which will be out at Explore, which is just a quick little pitch on VMware Education, because I very strongly believe in enablement for myself and also my team here at End to End. We've been knocking off certifications and updating things like crazy the last few months. There's something like 16 courses that have been completed and a whole bunch of exams and a lot more to come. So, even with a team of 4 VCDXs, we're very committed to even doing courses where you might think this is a VCP level course. Well, even if it's just a refresher that you smash through pretty quickly, that's important to me to make sure that those skills are maintained. And if you do a VCP level or a VCAP level sort of course, you'll always get something out of it. It might only be 1%, but I'm very happy if I learn 1%, because I feel like, I've learned a lot of material. So if I can just get one new thing,
it's a good
anytime
point,
I attend
Josh.
It's great.
There's always, when you're talking to people, you will find nuggets of knowledge, nuggets of wisdom from the strangest places. And doing entry level, mid level, professional, advanced courses, there's always something to learn, because someone has a slightly different experience to yours and they'll have another point of view, and you go, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Absolutely. And some of the content I've gone through recently, actually, I was reading a book, actually, and, I won't name the book, but there was a section in there that I pretty strongly disagreed with, actually. So I was reading this book. I was like, oh, this is a really good book, lots of good information. A lot of it I knew, but it was good to validate what I knew was also shared by others. And there was this one section where I disagreed, and I had a chat with James Worth, one of the end-to-end guys, and James was like, yeah, I disagree with that as well. And then I decided, I might actually put out a Lightboard video on this topic rather than responding to the book. Just here's my thoughts on this topic. And I recorded that last night, and came very naturally. It was like this conversation, just up there on the Lightboard, just talking about concepts and adding pieces in. And that's what you get. You get inspired when you read something or do a course or talk to someone to take the next step. So there's now going to be a Lightboard video out there on this topic that wouldn't have otherwise been out there for the community had I not gone through and been reading a book or doing a course or whatever it is. So, and for sure, if anyone disagrees with a blog that I write or a Lightboard video I put out, I would love to hear your thoughts, because the best thing for me is if someone can show me that my opinion is flawed, because it means I've missed something, because my opinion's based on the evidence I have available. Yeah. So if I'm missing a piece of evidence and someone can educate me on that and show me where that information is, I can make a better and more informed decision. So don't be scared to put out a blog and someone go, haha, you're wrong. Oh, okay, well, actually, haha, I just learned something. So this is great.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably one of the things about going through programs like VCDX is your ego just disappears. There is no ego. You do the best you can. You know that you're human, you have limitations, and iron sharpens iron. And as you get exposed to new ideas, you just continue to evolve. It's a never-ending process.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember my panel very well. And I remember going in there go, oof, geez, I know all these the people. Names. Wow. Yeah, and and obviously Mark Brunstad's pretty much on every panel because he's sitting there adjudicating. But I remember going, I know my design. I know why I did things. I might not be the smartest guy. I'm definitely not the smartest guy in this room, but I'm going to see how I go. And when they're asking the questions, I either knew the answer or knew what I was going to say because I'd prepared, or I found out something I didn't prepare sufficiently and I happened to know, or I didn't prepare sufficiently and I just didn't know. At which point you just say, I don't know.
Well, that's an interesting point. Some of my biggest breakthroughs have been when I've been asked questions or challenged on something that a stance that I've taken in front of a panel. And then there's that critical thinking under pressure on the spot. And when that happens, it's like just this flash of understanding that you get. And for me, it really improved my confidence speaking in front of large groups of people and aggressive customers or hostile customers. Now hostile customers, they don't bother me at all because it all just comes down to logic and having a conversation. And when you start changing their way of thinking, you know that, okay, I've got a set of skills that actually has value.
Yeah, and it's not an emotional topic either. So architecture is very logical.
Zero
so if
ego.
someone's upset, that's simply they're upset due to a situation. They're human. They're entitled to have those feelings. But our job there is to reassure them.
Yeah.
We've seen this situation before. We understand what you're experiencing. Here are the options. Here are the pros and cons of each option. Let's talk through which one you feel more comfortable with and guide them down the track of getting out of that bad situation. And a lot of the time I find when people have a bad experience with technology, usually it's because they haven't had the right advice. They haven't had someone there to guide them, a mentor through the technology. And unfortunately, occasionally, it's the skill set of a systems integrator or a vendor. Yeah. It was lacking, and they have a bad experience, even with a product which might be very good, but it's implemented and used incorrectly. Yeah. Therefore, the experience wasn't up to scratch. So I think that's one thing my company's trying to provide is making sure customers get that guidance. And where there's a partner who's very well trusted but is missing a skill set, my team can come in and complement that partner as opposed to competing. Because I think the skill set that yourself and my team have is quite unique. There's not a lot of us, so we don't need to compete with other partners. We just really need to come in and say, hey, we're here for the 301 and the 401, and your existing partner who does a great job of most things at the 101 and the 201, continue doing that. we'll even mentor them. We'll make them better so that your next solution, they can maybe do the 301. And we'll be pushed back to just the 401.
You augment the team and then help the customer be successful. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's probably what we've always done in our roles, regardless of where we've worked, is we've always just tried to make the customer or our colleagues better. And actually, that's probably the most rewarding thing about having the skill set of a VCDX, is being able to help customers and colleagues and friends. Even mentoring other VCDXs has been a fantastic experience, because I really get a kick out of it. Someone says, "Oh, I passed." I'm like, I'm not surprised. I saw all the effort you put in.
Yeah, it is a nice feeling seeing people that you're coaching succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. So fantastic. Well, Rene, I've had a great time chatting with you. It's always a great time speaking to someone as smart as you. So thank you for taking an hour and a bit out of your day.
Thanks for having me on.
And I'm looking forward to catching up in person at some stage in the not too distant future.
Likewise.
Thanks very much.